1990 was unfortunately the last year of the Midnight Express, who in their best incarnation with beautiful Bobby Eaton and sweet Stan Lane, were generally the best tag team in Jim Crockett Promotions and World Championship Wrestling from 1987 through 1990, since the Fantastics were often elsewhere. The national expansion efforts of Jim Crockett Jr., who had been NWA president since 1981, were an answer to Vince McMahon's quest to turn the WWF into the world's largest circus. But Crockett buying out or merging with as many of the NWA's regional territories as he could, including Ole Anderson's Championship Wrestling from Georgia, Sam Mushnick's St. Louis Wrestling Club, Bob Geigel's Central States, Mike Graham's Championship Wrestling from Florida, and Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling, resulted in a lot of deficit spending. While several factors from the bad management of not understanding how to book a cost-effective national tour, to the bad luck of the tragic car crash that ended the career of the man who was being groomed as the promotion's top star, Magnum TA, played a big part in Crockett being almost bankrupt in 1988. Arguably the biggest issue was McMahon sabotaging Crockett's biggest shows. Crockett had gambled on new streams of revenue, but Vince put his newly created Survivor Series on pay-per-view against the NWA's first pay-per-view, Starrcade 87, threatening to no longer offer WWF pay-per-views to cable companies who also carried Starrcade. After being scolded by cable companies who reasonably preferred to make as much money as they could from as many events as possible, to never pull that crap again, Vince instead gave away his newly created Royal Rumble on cable TV against the NWA's second pay-per-view attempt, the Bunkhouse Stampede 88. Crockett sold to billionaire Ted Turner in November 1988, but in more optimistic times, he had signed his hardest working, and certainly one of his top drawing teams, the Midnight Express, to $225,000 a year contracts. Rather than trying to get as much out of the Midnight Express as they could before signing them to lesser contracts the next year, there were attempts by Crockett's successors over the next 2 years to devalue the team and split them up, even after they took a $100,000 pay cut with their new contract. The Midnight Express briefly left in 1989 to wait out Booker George Scott being fired in April, rather than have him continue to devalue them, because working them every day wasn't going to get rid of them, like it might the even more highly paid Road Warriors. They got their termination notices from Jim Herd in February 1990, even though Cornette was still on the booking committee. Herd wanted Cornette to announce rather than manage, and for the Express to be split up, with Lane being a babyface. Herd agreed to the Express staying together and joining the Four Horsemen with Eaton's best friend, Arn Anderson, and frat boy Ric Flair, with Cornette selling them to Woman then putting them over as heel announcer, only to go back on his promise a few days later. Cornette then quit the booking committee, with the rest of the bookers ganged up on Herd to force him to re-sign them as a team. They stayed on because you couldn't escape the silliness Herd was alienating WCW's audience that still wanted to take wrestling serious with by going to the WWF to face Vince's idea of a Hall of Fame team, the Bushwhackers. And you couldn't make as much kicking around the indies, who were getting increasingly silly as well, with gimmicks such as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles inspired Cowabunga. Whether or not the front office was willing to recognize it, the Midnight Express were the key to WCW's tag team division in 1990. They were the only heel team that was willing and able to make the faces look great, but also had an impressive enough offense that the match wasn't hurt by them being in control. It was thus no surprise that pretty much all the good WCW tag matches of 1990 involved the Midnight Express, even though they'd been reduced to feuding over the lesser US tag titles in the mid-card, rather than drawing good numbers near the top of the card. The promotion's primary belts, the NWA World Tag Titles, were held by two of the many no-selling teams the division was riddled with, the Steiner Brothers and Doom. The Midnight Express vs. Steiner Brothers matches barely felt like Midnight Express matches because it was just the Midnight Express selling the whole time, as you would expect. Even when Rick Steiner supposedly injured his left shoulder in one of their TV matches, he still dominated 1 against 2, just using his right arm. While the Steiner Brothers weren't boring because they had impressive offense, their matches were very samey, looking indestructible as they tossed the opponents around. The Road Warriors, Skyscrapers, Doom, and the Samoan SWAT team were lesser variations of the same mentality of just putting themselves over. Even the fabulous Freebirds no longer wanted to sell. That might have been somewhat understandable if they still had their large intimidating star Terry Gordy, who actually sold quite a bit more than the current members. This was the flabulous Freebirds featuring Michael P.S. Hayes, who Ted DiBiase had dubbed the Prissy Sissy. Hayes was a charismatic talker, but even his most successful booker, Cowboy Bill Watts, tried to mostly use him as the manager of the actual workers, Gordy and Buddy Jack Roberts, so Hayes wouldn't screw up the matches. Rather than those quality workers, Hayes was now meant to be carried by Jimmy Extra Jam Garvin, who was passable in his earlier days as a scrawny little weasel that needed to cheat to escape with a victory, but was completely ridiculous, essentially acting like another one of the division's monsters without the physique or presence to back it up. The Rock and Roll Express were different than the majority of the tag division, but their matches had followed the same bland, boring, and repetitive formula since the dawn of time, with the Rod Stewart wannabe wearing it well, then Robert Gibson eventually making the hot tag for some punches in the dropkick. Their February 25th tag against the Midnight Express from Wrestle War 90 was the division's most overrated match of the year, with the silliness of Cornette combined with all the stalling and diversions early on, keeping me from ever really being able to take it seriously. The match did pick up in the second half during the Midnight's lengthy heat segment, but the payoff was Gibson doing nothing on his hot tag, and the match almost immediately ending with him scoring a totally unconvincing flash pin. One of the good programs the Midnight Express had was with Flyin' Brian and Z-Man. Pillman wouldn't reach his peak until the end of 1991, with his great series against Jushin Thunder Liger, but while he was still working on moving his high-flying offense beyond the generic 1980s staples we saw endlessly from the Rock and Roll Express, his hard work combined with his energy, effort, and general enthusiasm for performing already made him one of the promotion's best watches. Zink had a good look, but was nowhere near Pillman's level as an athlete or a charismatic performer. The team relied heavily on Pillman carrying the load, but when he was motivated during his hot comebacks, Zink was good enough. These teams had good matches on February 7th, where Pillman and Z-Man advanced to the final of the US Tag Title Tournament, and at Capital Combat 90 from May 19th, where the Midnight Express won the titles. The Midnight Express's best opposition in 1990 was a newly arrived Wild-Eyed Southern Boys team of Tracy Smothers and Steve Armstrong, a fiery and energetic duo who debuted in WCW on April 23rd, after having competed together semi-regularly in NWA, New Japan, and CWF during the previous 3 years. Though Pillman had more upside than Smothers and Armstrong, the Southern Boys were a more complete team than Pillman and Zink because both members had good offense and were willing and able to sell. Smothers is one of the more underrated wrestlers of his era because most people really only remember him during the silly full-blooded Italian gimmick that Paul Heyman strapped him with in ECW. A skilled and well-rounded performer, Smothers had a unique striking style with his back fists and super kicks that was fun without being too ridiculous, and he was also ahead of the 80s American high-flying bar in his running and jumping offense. Midnight Express and Southern Boys had good action-packed TV sprints on May 1st and September 10th. These fast-paced and energetic matches were distinguished by quick tags, nice teamwork, big bumps mostly by the Express, and Eaton and the Southern Boys coming off the top rope. Length only helps to a point, but in this case, the difference between these matches and their July 7th, 1990 Great American Bash match being 1990 WCW Match of the Year, and one of the best American tag matches of the decade, was that at 18 minutes 14 seconds, they had an extra 10 minutes to properly develop the match. This had a little more bawling from the heels, but for the most part the extra time didn't slow things down. It was still almost all action from start to finish, with the emphasis on cohesive units double teaming that set classic tag wrestling apart, and minimal diversions despite the Midnight Express being heels who were happy to take shortcuts. The timing and execution were totally on, but it didn't feel too cooperative despite all the multi-man spots. Smothers had excellent chemistry with both opponents, which wasn't surprising given Lane and his previous Fabulous One's partner Steve Kern had trained him, and Eaton was a top worker that could make anyone look better. The Southern Boys were on fire from the outset in their first pay-per-view appearance. This had a lot more shine than the typical Southern tag, because the Midnight Express had to get over these relative unknowns who had debuted in WCW just 2.5 months earlier, and were supporting the Confederate flag on their tights on a show taking place in the Union state of Maryland. It was much more interesting seeing this more competitive and less predictable structuring. Despite actually having height, the Southern Boys clearly exceeded the promotion's other tag teams when it came to athletic offense, and this really stood out as a quick-hitting, fast-moving affair that felt more modern and less predictable than the tired generic 80s formula tags the Rock and Roll Express never moved beyond. For the most part, this match was made by Tracy Smothers and Bobby Eaton, the star performers of their teams. However, Armstrong and Lane still elevated this, aiding their partners with several smooth double-team spots. Steve Armstrong may not have been as smooth and technically competent as his brother Brad, and certainly didn't make his opponent look as good, but he had a lot more enthusiasm and was more interested in keeping a high pace by running, jumping, and flying around, staying in as a point of pride even though he was losing. Eaton had plenty of momentary advantages, but Smothers had answer after answer, using his athleticism to outmaneuver the veteran. Smothers used his karate to outdo Eaton, so Lane, whose educated feet were made famous by Jim Ross, came in to match Smothers for a classic redneck karate duel. There were lots of savate kicks, because every martial arts kick seemed to be a savate kick according to JR. Otherwise, Ross provided the great commentary he was known for in this era, taking the match seriously and providing the sports-based presentation that is so lacking even in his own announcing in later decades, albeit partly because you can't credibly call a match that doesn't take itself seriously. The Midnight Express had the widest variety and generally most innovative quick-hitting double-team spots of this era. This was a great example of how tag matches should be wrestled, using the fresh man to maintain the pace. As the match progressed, the Midnight Express tagged much more frequently to get their double teams in, but Smothers still kept sneaking out of what the opposition was trying, and making plenty of comebacks. They kept the crowd reacting to everything. The Midnight Express certainly took their shortcuts, but today none of them slowed down or spoiled the action. Smothers and Armstrong matched the Midnights move for move and strike for strike, even when the Express figured to have them down for the count. This had a lot more near finishes than you would expect from an American match of the time period, complete with a Killer Bees switcheroo by the Southern Boys that actually didn't work. The Midnight Express ultimately won when Lane blindsided Smothers with another quote-unquote savate kick from the apron when Smothers was running the ropes, and Eaton pinned him in the small package. These were true tag teams that worked in unison to really rise above the sum of their parts, rather than individuals temporarily paired. Unfortunately, you don't get much of that today. The art of tag team wrestling with dedicated full-time performers has been lost to the revolving door of completely interchangeable units that offer little beyond t-shirt sales. This great athletic contest should have been the direction the tag team division went in, and a sign of great things to come in WCW. Jim Cornette had had enough of the clueless former Pizza Hut manager Jim Herd trying to emulate the childishness of Vince McMahon's circus, though. He wasn't impressed by the proposed undefeatable tag team the Hunchbacks, whose rounded backs kept their shoulders off the canvas, and Herd's cluelessness towards submissions even being a thing probably kept them from losing that way. Cornette also wasn't excited by the bell-wearing ding-dongs, who jingled all the way. Herd joining Vince McMahon in his vendetta against actual wrestling, with his ridiculous ideas for childish cartoon BS you can't take as a serious athletic contest, irreparably destroyed the credibility of American wrestling because everyone that came after them or pretended to be an alternative also refused to remove the nonsense from the lexicon. Instead of trying to get all the fans of sports-based wrestling to be fervent fans of a promotion they could respect and get behind, one promoter and booker after another grasped at the 1,000 fans of every aspect introduced into the vaudeville variety show pro wrestling became, despite every metric showing that sports entertainment makes far less money as a whole than pro wrestling did as a whole. When wrestling is merely a parody of itself, there's no reason to consistently tune in. You might binge on the couple sideshow acts you get a kick out of, but if you can take them seriously enough to care, they're sure to run into opponents that make a mockery of things soon enough. It's a mistake to believe that people will care enough about comedy acts that they'll keep tuning in, despite it only being for shits and giggles, or that people will care enough about their supposedly serious favorites that it doesn't matter how silly the opposition is. Capturing one of the 10 meaningless titles each promotion has isn't exactly winning the Super Bowl. Laughing at wrestling just doesn't engender that kind of passion, the kind where you need to be along for the entire ride. People today pop for moments, but you don't get sustained reactions to entire matches like you did in this Midnight Express vs. Southern Boys match, or the majority of competitive matches from the days when wrestling could be taken seriously. WWE can currently muster more fans with a worldwide audience for a single show in a city they may not run again for a year than pretty much any territory could pull from the million or something people close enough to drive to their weekly house show in the same building, but wrestling was drawing thousands of fans in most regions of America, Mexico, Japan, Britain, and Canada every night in the kayfabe era, with most of them coming back for more week after week. Cornette and Lane quit WCW before the October 30th TV tapings when Cornette complained to Ole Anderson about the Midnight Express being scheduled for 4 matches that day after Eaton was there all day for nothing the day before. Ole told Cornette, "If you don't like it, go home," and Cornette did just that, for good. Eaton had 3 kids to provide for, so he stayed on while Cornette worked on setting up Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Eaton was such a good worker, and so well liked, that his WCW deal kept being renewed long after Cornette's territory came and went. Eaton was a quality wrestler for another decade, but never reached the same heights he did with the Midnight Express, as he was a much better tag wrestler, with his quick tags allowing him to keep a high pace, whereas in singles we'd get a rest hold rather than a double team and a series of kicks from Lane. More importantly, WCW never really pushed him in the 90s, even though they kept him around, despite briefly holding the TV title in 1991 and holding the tag titles with Arn Anderson in 1992. With Eaton out of the picture, Lane formed the original Heavenly Bodies with Dr. Tom Pritchard and SMW, though his retirement on May 15, 1993 resulted in the better and more famous incarnation of that team, with Jimmy Backlund being renamed Jimmy Del Rey because Lane's fictitious hometown was Delray Beach, Florida. The Southern Boys were never given the opportunity to capitalize on this great pay-per-view introduction. Their Midnight Express program unresolved, they were left to the uninspiring program with the second-rate Freebirds. Turner switched them to the Young Pistols from Cheyenne, Wyoming to lose their Civil War imagery, and they got one forgettable run with the US tag titles, turning heel and feuding with the awful Patriots team of Firebreaker Chip, who seemed better suited to be a replacement of the Village People, and Todd Champion, who appeared to be less talented than most of the jobbers, despite his lofty surname. Armstrong left WCW in April 1992, joining his brother Scott in SMW to feud with the Heavenly Bodies after a brief run in WWF as Lance Cassidy, a cowboy now hailing from the great state of Texas. Smothers lasted another 4 months in WCW before joining SMW as well, where he was one of their top singles wrestlers, including 2 runs with the SMW heavyweight title. This Midnight Express vs. Southern Boy match was 4 stars, but even though the Southern Boys were in their 20s and Eaton was 31 years old, their new circumstances unfortunately never provided another opportunity for any of them to deliver another definitive classic.